Hi, welcome to Mrs. Mika's class. Today we're going to be talking about elements of a short story. So what exactly is a short story? Well, the definition of a short story is a written story that is brief and shorter than a novel, usually containing fewer characters. Also, a short story is a fictional story that may be based on a true story. Has a beginning, middle, and end, just like any other story. It usually has between 500 and 7,500 words, although there are short stories that have an upwards of 15,000 words. Today we're going to talk about important story elements. Those are setting, where the story takes place. The characters, who is the story about? The plot, what is the problem or scene of the story? The conflict also deals with the problem of the story. The theme, what is the overall story about? Let's break these down a little bit further. Let's start with the setting. The setting is the time and place in which the story happens. Maybe it's set back in the 1900s. Perhaps it's in the daytime, perhaps it's in the nighttime. It also describes such details as landscape, scenery, buildings, season, or weather. Maybe the story takes place in Antarctica. Setting has major effects on the story. It can set the tone or mood of the story. If you're reading a story where it rains all the time, perhaps it's gloomy. Some more examples of settings are maybe your story is centered around 123 Vine Street. Maybe the entire story is on an airplane, or it's at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Maybe your best friend's treehouse. Also, a setting on Mars would be very different from a setting on a sailboat. The setting can be very important. You would explain the details of each. What are the details if the setting is on Mars? How about on a sailboat? Another very important aspect of a setting is the time period. Maybe your story is set back in the time where the Wild West, where everybody used wagons to get around. Or maybe it's set in modern times and current times where you're riding in a car. These items would be very out of place in a story if it wasn't set back in the pioneer or modern times. Time period is very important. Let's talk about character. Character is a person, animal, or object that takes part in the action of the story. Character also are very important to the development of the story, and through characters, the author reveals characterization. What's characterization? Let's take a look. Characterization is when the author reveals characters through what they think, how they feel, what they say, and also what they do. You get to know the people in the story through characterization. Now let's talk about plot. It can be very involved. Plot is a series of events and character actions that create the story. See, basically the events in the story. Plot can also relate to the central conflict and is one of the most important elements of the story. We can also say that plot has its own group of elements or order of events. And these elements are exposition, conflict, climax, falling action, and resolution. Let's take a look at those further. Let's break those down. So when we talk about plot and we talk about its elements, exposition reveals the story's characters and the setting. Basically, it's the beginning. Conflict is the action or main problem in the story. Climax is the turning point of the story. Falling action is the events or actions bringing the story toward the ending or resolution. The resolution is everything comes together. It's the ending of the story and how the problem is solved. Now, conflict is a little more simple. The struggle between two or more people, things within the story. The character is usually on one side of the central conflict or the struggle. And many times it's referred to as the rising action. The struggle can be with one or with many things or people. Let's talk about conflict and the different types of conflict. First of all, we have the struggle between two people or two characters, and it shows character versus character conflict. Some examples might be a parent against a parent, a child against a parent, a friend against a friend. We also have conflict with nature, which is character versus nature. Perhaps it is someone against a storm, or the conflict of you against a tornado or hurricane. We also have this struggle with society, which is character versus society. Perhaps a student is against wearing school uniforms, and the entire school district wears uniforms. So that person is in a struggle against the school district wearing school uniforms. And then we have the struggle with themselves. Sometimes characters struggle with themselves on what to do. Maybe they came across a wallet full of money and they're struggling. They really want to keep the money, but they know it's not right to do. Let's talk about the theme. Theme is what the author wants you to know or learn about the story. Theme can also be a message a writer or author communicates to a reader. And sometimes theme represents a moral of a story. Do you ever hear of the story where Peter and the Wolf, where Peter cried wolf every time he was playing a joke on the townspeople, and every so often he would cry while he was tending the sheep. He would cry wolf. He would cry wolf several times, and finally, at the end of the story, no one came when a real wolf appeared. So the moral of the story is, don't cry for help or cry for wolf unless you really need it. Some examples of theme are maybe honesty, which we just talked about, survival, person versus nature. A big one is good versus evil. In many books and stories, you see the characters on good versus evil. Also courage, the characters showing bravery, family and friendship, perseverance. Survival is another big one. There's also a way to plot the story through a diagram. You can map the story on a plot diagram. It looks like this. Exposition would be the beginning of the story. You're talking about the characters and the setting. You have the conflict of the story or rising action. Maybe it's the problem of the story. The climax would be the big reveal of the story. Maybe the problem is who was stealing the money, and the climax would be, it wasn't who we thought it was. It was the grandfather who was stealing the money. The falling action might be catch up with the grandfather and find out why, and it's starting to tie the loose ends together. And in the end, maybe you find out the grandfather wasn't really stealing the money. He was putting it in a bank account for his grandchildren. So more short stories. Let's talk about this. There are much more ideas and information to learn about short stories, their elements, and how they are developed in their meanings. For the purposes of tomorrow's assignment, you will have all the information that you need. But please feel free to go back and revisit the presentation at any time to help you with the upcoming assignments. So, an upcoming assignment that we're going to be working on is your assignment will be to read Ambrose Bierce, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. And with a highlighter, you're going to highlight the short story elements that we went over today. You're also, the elements that we went over today are setting, character, plot, conflict, and theme. You are also going to draw and label a short story plot diagram based on the information that you highlighted in the story. After this lesson, you should now know about the elements of short stories. I look forward to seeing you in upcoming class tomorrow. Bye.